Find a girl, and bring me one of her scarves." The gray wolf's amber eyes widened. "Your Majesty, I've tracked fugitives across mountain ranges, guarded the royal family through blizzards, and stood beside you in every crisis. Are you really asking me to steal a scarf?" King Lucian Blackwood didn't answer immediately. He stood before the tall windows of Blackwood Palace, watching moonlight spill across the castle gardens. "I'm asking my most trusted brother to help me find someone." Ash studied the king's face. They had grown up together, laughed together, and faced every challenge side by side. He knew Lucian better than anyone alive, which was exactly why he realized something extraordinary had happened. Kings didn't lose sleep over strangers. "It all started 2 weeks ago, didn't it?" Ash asked quietly. Lucian gave the smallest nod, and the memory returned as vividly as if it had happened only moments before. Every summer, the kingdom celebrated the Lavender Festival, when thousands gathered beneath endless rows of blooming flowers stretching across the countryside. Music drifted through the streets, local artisans displayed handmade treasures, and the air carried the comforting fragrance of fresh lavender. It was the only day each year when Lucian slipped away from the palace without royal robes or guards surrounding him. Dressed as an ordinary traveler, he wandered through the festival simply to remember what life felt like beyond palace walls. He sampled warm pastries from a family bakery, listened to children laughing near a puppet show, and greeted merchants who never realized they were speaking to their king. For the first time in months, he felt completely at peace. Then the wind changed. A gentle breeze crossed the lavender fields before weaving through the crowded street. Lucian stopped so suddenly that another visitor nearly walked into him. Something about the fragrance caught him completely off guard. It wasn't merely lavender. It was softer, warmer, almost impossible to describe. Sunlight resting on clean cotton. Fresh air after a summer morning. Wild lavender blooming beneath an open sky. His heart beat just a little faster. Almost without thinking, he turned toward the source. There she was. A young woman stood beside a flower stall, carefully wrapping a bouquet for an elderly customer. A pale lavender scarf rested around her shoulders, and the breeze played gently with loose strands of her golden hair. She smiled with effortless kindness, the kind that made people around her smile without realizing why. Lucian couldn't remember the music playing in the square. He couldn't remember the colorful banners fluttering overhead. But somehow, he knew he would remember that smile for a very long time. He took a hesitant step toward her, then another. Before he could reach her, a lively parade swept between them, filling the street with dancers, musicians, and cheering families. When the crowd finally moved on, she was gone. Lucian searched every nearby booth. He walked the entire marketplace twice. He even returned to the flower fields before sunset, hoping for one more glimpse. Nothing. The mysterious young woman had disappeared, leaving behind only the memory of lavender carried by the wind. He told himself it was foolish. By tomorrow, he would forget. Tomorrow came. He didn't forget. The first night, he lay awake longer than usual, wondering why a stranger's smile kept returning to his thoughts. The third night, he opened every window in his chamber, hoping the evening breeze might somehow carry that familiar fragrance again. By the seventh night, he found himself walking through the palace gardens beneath the stars instead of sleeping. By the 14th night, he finally admitted the truth to himself. He wasn't haunted by a festival. He wasn't searching for a scent. He wanted to find the young woman whose quiet kindness had stayed with him long after she vanished into the crowd. That realization brought him to only one person he trusted completely. Ash entered the royal study, expecting an urgent security briefing. "You sent for me, Your Majesty?" Lucian nodded once. "I have an important assignment." Ash's ears perked up immediately. "Finally, something dangerous." "Perhaps," Lucian replied. "Find the young woman from the Lavender Festival." Ash folded his front paws neatly. "Name? Unknown. Address? Unknown. Family? Unknown." Ash blinked. "Well, we're off to an excellent start." Despite himself, Lucian smiled faintly. "Learn who she is. Make sure she's safe. Don't let her know you're there." "Understood." Ash nodded confidently. "Anything else?" Lucian hesitated for only a heartbeat. "If you can, bring back one item she wears often. A scarf, a cardigan, a sweater, anything that still carries the fragrance of lavender." Silence settled over the room. Ash stared at him for several long seconds before slowly lifting one paw to his forehead. Your Majesty, Lucian calmly raised an eyebrow. Yes. So let me make sure I understand my royal mission correctly. I'm not rescuing a princess. No, I'm not stopping an invasion. No, I'm borrowing a sweater. Lucian looked out toward the moonlit kingdom once more. Without damaging it, Ash let out a dramatic sigh that echoed through the study. I never imagined my greatest challenge would involve a clothesline. As he turned to leave, Lucian quietly added one final instruction. Ash. The gray wolf glanced back. Don't frighten her. Ash's expression softened for the first time that evening. I won't. He padded toward the door, muttering under his breath. Honestly, how difficult can borrowing one scarf possibly be? The following morning, Ash stood on a grassy hill overlooking the quiet village with the determination of a seasoned royal guardian and the expression of someone who still could not believe his latest assignment. Find the mysterious Lavender girl, he whispered confidently. Simple enough. He unfolded a hand-drawn map with one paw, looked toward the cottages scattered across the valley, then sighed. Borrow one of her favorite scarves. His ears drooped. That part still sounds ridiculous. Even so, if the request came from Lucian, he would carry it out without hesitation. They had grown up together long before Lucian wore a crown. Through every challenge, every victory, and every difficult season, Ash had stood beside him not only as a trusted protector, but as the brother fate had quietly chosen for them both. If the king could not sleep because of one unforgettable memory, then Ash would find the answer. Villages always revealed their stories to those willing to listen, so instead of searching with suspicion, Ash wandered through the morning marketplace like any ordinary traveler. He paused beside fruit stands, listened to cheerful conversations, and soon one name floated through the air again and again. Evelyn Harper. Miss Harper helped repair our church garden after the spring storm, one elderly gardener said proudly. She never accepts payment when she brings lavender bouquets to my wife, a smiling baker added. A young boy proudly held up a small wooden toy. Miss Evelyn painted this for me because she said every knight deserves a brave horse. Everywhere Ash looked, people smiled before they even finished saying her name. He found himself smiling too. Your Majesty, he murmured beneath his breath. I believe you accidentally became fascinated with the sweetest woman in the kingdom. Following the familiar fragrance drifting across the breeze, Ash quietly reached a charming white cottage surrounded by neat rows of blooming lavender. Hidden beneath the wide branches of an old oak tree, he watched Evelyn kneel among the flowers with a woven basket resting beside her. She trimmed each lavender stem with gentle care, humming a soft tune that blended naturally with birdsong. A tiny rabbit wandered into the garden and immediately began nibbling on the nearest blossoms. Instead of chasing it away, Evelyn laughed warmly, picked another bundle of lavender, and placed it a few feet away. These ones are for you, little friend, she said with a bright smile. The rabbit happily accepted the invitation, and Ash could not stop the amused grin spreading across his own face. No wonder, he whispered. The king never had a chance. A few minutes later, Evelyn noticed an elderly neighbor struggling to carry a heavy basket of vegetables across the path. Without thinking twice, she hurried over to help. Let me carry those home for you, Mrs. Parker, she said. You helped me enough when I was little. It is my turn now. The older woman squeezed her hand gratefully before the two disappeared down the lane together. Watching the simple exchange, Ash quietly nodded to himself. Kindness like that could not be rehearsed. It simply belonged to her. By late afternoon, Evelyn returned home carrying freshly washed clothes folded neatly in her arms. One by one she hung a soft cardigan, a cozy sweater, a pale blue dress, and finally the same lavender scarf Lucian had described without ever realizing he was describing it. The breeze lifted the fabric gently, carrying its delicate fragrance across the yard. Even from where he remained hidden, Ash understood exactly why Lucian had never forgotten that single afternoon at the festival. Back at Blackwood Palace, Lucian stood beside the library window pretending to read the same page for nearly 20 minutes. Every few moments his eyes drifted toward the distant road leading into the village. The book remained open, but he had not turned a single page. He quietly wondered whether Ash had found her, whether she was safe, and whether she still smiled the same way she had beneath the summer sunlight. Meanwhile, beneath the oak tree, Ash slowly inhaled, glanced from the fluttering scarf to the peaceful cottage, and whispered to himself, "Walk in, borrow the scarf, walk out." That is the plan. Just as he gathered enough courage to take his first careful step, Evelyn suddenly paused, tilted her head toward the old oak tree, and slowly turned in his direction. Evelyn remained perfectly still for a brief moment, her eyes resting on the old oak tree as the afternoon breeze quietly stirred the lavender around her. Ash immediately lowered himself behind the thick trunk, barely daring to breathe. "Please do not bark," he whispered to himself. After a second, he blinked. "I am literally a wolf." He closed his eyes in quiet embarrassment. A tiny bluebird suddenly landed on a nearby fence and chirped loudly enough to draw Evelyn's attention away from the tree. She smiled at the little visitor instead, gently waving one hand before continuing toward the clothesline. Ash slowly exhaled with visible relief. "Thank you," he murmured respectfully toward the unsuspecting bird. "You may have just saved the reputation of the royal guard." He waited patiently until Evelyn carried another basket inside the cottage. The yard became wonderfully quiet. Only the breeze remained, gently lifting the lavender scarf as it danced above the clothesline. Ash cautiously peeked over the fence. Left, right, window, garden, door. Everything appeared peaceful. "Walk in," he quietly reminded himself. "Borrow the scarf. Walk out." Nothing complicated. He took one careful step into the yard, then another. Every movement was slow enough that even the butterflies resting on nearby flowers remained undisturbed. Reaching the clothesline, he carefully lifted the wooden clothespin holding the lavender scarf. "Your Majesty," he whispered with a tired smile, "you owe me several years of peaceful retirement after this." He folded the soft fabric neatly instead of stuffing it beneath his shoulder, making certain it remained perfectly clean before slipping silently back toward the fence. Just as he reached the gate, the front door opened again. Ash froze. Evelyn stepped outside carrying a small watering can, humming the very same melody she had sung while tending her flowers earlier that afternoon. Instead of running, Ash quietly lowered himself behind a row of blooming lavender bushes only a few yards away. Hidden beneath their fragrant blossoms, he waited without making the slightest sound. Evelyn walked slowly through the garden, watering each flower with patient care. She paused beside the clothesline, tilted her head slightly, and smiled to herself. "That is strange," she said softly. "I could have sworn there was another scarf here." She looked around the peaceful yard, but there was no fear in her expression, only gentle confusion. "Maybe I brought it inside already," she whispered with a small laugh before returning to her flowers. Ash watched her disappear around the corner of the cottage before quietly slipping through the gate with the scarf safely tucked beneath one foreleg. The journey back to Blackwood Palace felt much shorter than the trip into the village. By sunset, he entered Lucien's private study and carefully placed the folded lavender scarf onto the king's desk. Lucien looked at it silently for several long seconds before lifting it with extraordinary care, as though it were the most precious gift he had ever received. The familiar fragrance filled the quiet room, and for the first time in 2 long weeks, the constant restlessness inside him finally softened. Ash leaned against the doorway with an exhausted sigh. "Mission accomplished," he announced. "But I have a feeling this is only the beginning." For days passed peacefully before Evelyn reached into her wardrobe one cool morning and suddenly stopped. She moved a few dresses aside, looked beneath a neatly folded blanket, then checked the wooden chair beside her bed. A faint crease appeared between her brows. "That is odd," she whispered. "I was certain my cream cardigan was right here." She searched the kitchen, the laundry basket, the porch, and even the little garden where she sometimes folded clothes beneath the afternoon sun. Nothing. She rested one hand on her hip and laughed softly at herself. "First my favorite scarf, now my cardigan. I must be more forgetful than I thought." Even as she said the words, they did not quite sound convincing. Evelyn rarely misplaced anything. Every basket had its place. Every flower tool returned to the same shelf. Every piece of clothing was folded with careful hands before sunset. Losing one favorite scarf had seemed unusual. Losing another well-loved cardigan only a few days later felt impossible. Later that afternoon, while delivering fresh lavender bouquets around the village, she casually mentioned the missing cardigan to Mrs. Parker. The elderly woman smiled kindly. "Perhaps one of those little woodland animals borrowed it for the winter." Evelyn laughed warmly. If a rabbit has learned to wear cardigans, I suppose I cannot be upset. Both women shared a cheerful laugh before continuing down the quiet lane. The conversation should have ended there, but the question quietly lingered in Evelyn's thoughts all the way home. Back at Blackwood Palace, Ash carefully placed the neatly folded cardigan onto Lucien's desk. Unlike the first time, Lucien did not immediately reach for it. Instead, his first question came almost instinctively. How is she? Ash smiled knowingly. Healthy, busy, smiling as always. Only then did Lucien allow himself to relax. He gently lifted the cardigan, closed his eyes for a brief moment, and a peaceful expression softened his face. Thank you, he said sincerely. Ash folded his front paws. You realize she thinks she misplaced 2 pieces of clothing now. Lucien slowly opened his eyes again. I know. A quiet silence settled between them before Lucien added, when the time is right, I will make everything right. Ash studied his oldest friend for a moment and nodded. He believed every word. 2 mornings later, hidden once again beneath the familiar oak tree, Ash watched Evelyn carefully hanging another freshly washed sweater onto the clothesline. This time she did not immediately walk back inside. Instead, she stood with her arms folded, quietly studying every piece of clothing fluttering in the breeze, as though trying to solve a puzzle only she could see. Ash swallowed nervously. She is starting to notice a pattern, he whispered. He looked from the sweater to the cottage door, then back toward Evelyn. I have crossed rivers, climbed cliffs, and outrun storms, he quietly sighed. Why does one peaceful clothesline suddenly feel like the most dangerous place in the kingdom? As the evening sun slowly disappeared beyond the lavender fields, Evelyn glanced once more at the clothesline before making up her mind. Tonight, she said with quiet determination, I am staying awake until I find out where my clothes keep disappearing. That evening, the little white cottage remained unusually bright long after sunset. Instead of preparing for bed as she always did, Evelyn quietly carried a rocking chair onto the front porch where she could see the clothesline without being seen herself. A warm blanket rested across her lap, an unfinished piece of embroidery sat in her hands, and a small lantern glowed softly beside her. Anyone passing by would have believed she was simply enjoying the peaceful night air. Only Evelyn knew she was patiently waiting for an answer. If someone truly keeps borrowing my clothes, she whispered with a thoughtful smile. Tonight we are finally going to meet. Several miles away, Ash stood outside the palace gates wearing the determined expression of someone preparing for an impossible mission. Lucien walked beside him and quietly placed the freshly folded cardigan back into Ash's care. Return this before sunrise, he said. Ash looked from the cardigan to the king. So now I am borrowing clothing only to return clothing. Lucien nodded with complete seriousness. Exactly, Ash sighed dramatically. One day historians are going to write about my service to the crown, and somehow this will be the chapter everyone remembers. Before Ash left, Lucien spoke once more. Please make certain she never feels afraid. Ash's playful smile softened immediately. She never will. By the time the moon climbed high above the lavender fields, Ash had reached the village once again. This time he avoided the familiar oak tree and instead slipped quietly behind a weathered garden shed at the edge of Evelyn's property. New hiding place, he whispered proudly. Personal growth. From there he carefully studied the yard. Everything looked ordinary. The clothesline swayed gently beneath the moonlight. A cozy sweater and a light apron fluttered peacefully in the cool breeze. No movement. No voices. No sign that anyone remained awake. Ash waited another 10 patient minutes. Either she is asleep, he whispered, or I am becoming far too suspicious. Believing the coast was finally clear, he quietly crossed the yard one careful step at a time. He reached the clothesline, gently lifted one wooden clothespin, and carefully folded the soft sweater beneath his foreleg. Smooth, he whispered proudly. Absolutely smooth. The moment he turned toward the gate, a tiny silver bell hidden beneath the clothesline gave a cheerful little ring. Ting! Ash froze so completely that even the evening breeze seemed louder than before. His ears slowly lowered. That, he whispered without moving a single inch, was definitely not smooth. From the front porch came the unmistakable sound of a rocking chair gently coming to a stop. Ash slowly closed his eyes. Your Majesty, he murmured under his breath with the faintest, most defeated smile. I believe the Lavender girl has officially declared war on your laundry mission." The cheerful ring of the little brass bell echoed through the quiet yard, and for one long heartbeat neither Evelyn nor Ash moved at all. Hidden behind the weathered garden shed, Ash slowly looked toward the porch just as Evelyn rose from her rocking chair with calm curiosity. She did not look frightened. She simply walked toward the clothesline one careful step at a time, her lantern casting a warm golden glow across the lavender blossoms. "Well," Ash whispered to himself, "this has officially become the least successful invisible mission in royal history." He glanced around the yard searching for a graceful escape. The fence suddenly looked much taller than he remembered. The open gate felt impossibly far away. Then a gentle gust of wind carried several empty flower baskets across the garden path, knocking one lightly against the wooden fence with a soft clatter. Evelyn instinctively turned toward the unexpected sound. Ash did not waste the opportunity. Moving with practiced silence, he slipped around the back of the shed, crossed behind a row of blooming lavender, and quietly disappeared into the moonlit field beyond the cottage. Only after he reached the safety of the open meadow did he finally stop to catch his breath. "I survived," he murmured gratefully. "Barely." Behind him, Evelyn searched the yard once more before smiling to herself. "Someone really has been here," she whispered. She noticed the tiny brass bell swinging gently beneath the clothesline and smiled even wider. "All right," she said softly. "Tomorrow I will be even better prepared." By sunrise, Ash returned to Blackwood Palace carrying the neatly folded sweater he had borrowed only hours earlier. He placed it beside the lavender scarf and quietly explained everything that had happened. Lucian listened without interrupting, but when Ash described the hidden bell and Evelyn waiting awake on the porch, the king slowly lowered his eyes. "She knows someone is visiting," he said quietly. "She does?" Ash answered with a nod. "She is curious, not afraid. But I do not believe we should continue like this much longer." Silence settled across the study. Morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows while Lucian looked toward the sweater resting on the polished desk. For the first time since the festival, the quiet comfort those familiar scents brought was joined by something else. Guilt. He had never wanted Evelyn to lose sleep because of him. He had never wanted her wondering whether someone was secretly crossing her garden at night. After several thoughtful moments, he carefully folded the sweater once more and handed it back to Ash. "Return everything before anyone notices," he said. Ash accepted it with a relieved smile. "I was hoping you would say that." Lucian walked toward the palace window overlooking the distant valley where the lavender fields stretched beneath the morning sun. A faint smile touched his face as he remembered the kindness in Evelyn's eyes, even though she had never truly seen his. "It is time I stop hiding behind borrowed memories," he said quietly. "The next time I see her, I will meet her myself." The following afternoon, Lucian left Blackwood Palace wearing a simple linen shirt beneath a weathered brown jacket, sturdy boots dusted with road gravel, and a canvas satchel resting across one shoulder. Nothing about him resembled a king. He looked like an ordinary traveler passing through a peaceful village, exactly as he had hoped. Before he departed, Ash circled him once with exaggerated seriousness. "You look completely ordinary." Lucian adjusted the satchel. "That was the goal." Ash nodded thoughtfully. "Good. Because if anyone mistakes you for royalty while carrying that bag, I am pretending we have never met." Lucian smiled despite himself. "I appreciate your loyalty." "My loyalty remains unquestioned," Ash replied proudly. "My dignity, however, has suffered greatly these past few weeks." Hidden among the trees overlooking the village road, Ash watched his oldest friend continue alone before quietly settling beneath the shade of a maple tree. "Go introduce yourself," he whispered with an encouraging grin. "No borrowed scarves. No mysterious missions. Just be yourself." A gentle breeze carried the familiar fragrance of lavender through the afternoon air as Lucian wandered toward the village marketplace. He was not searching anymore. He simply allowed his footsteps to follow the peaceful rhythm of the day. Children laughed while chasing one another across the square. Farmers greeted familiar neighbors. Fresh bread cooled beside an open bakery window. Then he saw her. Evelyn stepped carefully around the corner of a flower shop carrying a woven basket overflowing with fresh lavender bouquets. At the same moment, a playful puppy darted between her feet, happily chasing a fallen ribbon across the street. Startled, Evelyn stumbled slightly as the basket slipped from her hands. Before the bouquets could scatter across the cobblestones, another pair of hands caught the basket securely in midair. "I believe these belong to you," Lucien said with a warm smile. Evelyn looked up, surprised for only a moment before returning the same gentle smile that had remained in his memory ever since the festival. "Thank you," she said. "You saved me quite a bit of work." Together, they carefully straightened the lavender stems that had shifted inside the basket. The familiar fragrance drifted between them, softer now than Lucien remembered because it was no longer carried by the wind alone. It belonged to this quiet moment they unexpectedly shared. "You are new here," Evelyn observed kindly. "I do not think we have met before." Lucien nodded. "I have been traveling for a while." "Then welcome." Her voice carried the same effortless warmth he remembered. "Our village is small, but everyone tries to make visitors feel at home." Lucien glanced toward the lavender bouquets. "I can already tell." Evelyn laughed softly. "Then we must be doing something right." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The comfortable silence felt surprisingly natural, as though two strangers had somehow skipped past awkward introductions without realizing it. Nearby, hidden behind a fruit stand, Ash peeked around a stack of wooden crates and quietly folded his front paws with satisfaction. "Much better," he whispered. "Talking is definitely less complicated than borrowing sweaters." Lucien reluctantly stepped back, knowing he should not overstay a chance encounter. "Thank you for your kindness," he said sincerely. Evelyn tilted her head with a friendly smile. "You are welcome." As he turned to leave, she suddenly called after him. "Wait." Lucien stopped and looked back. Evelyn laughed softly, almost embarrassed by her own question. "I never asked your name." Lucien paused for the briefest moment after hearing Evelyn's question, and Ash nearly buried his face beneath his paws from his hiding place beyond the marketplace. "Please remember your own name," he whispered to himself. A gentle smile touched Lucien's face before he answered. "My name is Lucien." He offered nothing more, and somehow that simple honesty felt easier than any carefully prepared disguise. Evelyn repeated the name quietly, as though testing how it sounded. "It suits you." Lucien felt his heartbeat quicken in a way no battlefield or royal ceremony had ever managed. "Thank you," he replied. "And you are Evelyn." Her eyes widened with pleasant surprise. "Someone already told you?" Lucien nodded toward the cheerful marketplace around them. "It is impossible to spend 5 minutes here without hearing people speak kindly about you." A faint blush colored Evelyn's cheeks. "I hope they did not exaggerate too much." "If anything," Lucien answered sincerely, "I think they understated it." Evelyn laughed softly, the familiar sound carrying through the afternoon like another gentle breeze across the lavender fields. For a moment, neither of them hurried to fill the comfortable silence that followed. It was the kind of quiet usually shared between old friends, yet they had only just met. Evelyn shifted the basket slightly in her hands. "I was about to bring these bouquets to the little cafe near the square. They serve lavender honey tea every afternoon." She hesitated only a second before adding, "Would you like to join me? Travelers should not have to drink tea alone." Lucien accepted before he could overthink the invitation. "I would like that very much." Hidden behind a fruit cart, Ash slowly looked toward the sky. "Weeks of secret missions," he whispered dramatically. Apparently, all His Majesty needed was an invitation to tea. The cozy cafe overlooked the edge of the lavender fields where rows of purple blossoms stretched beneath the warm afternoon sun. Evelyn chose a small wooden table beside the open window, allowing the fresh breeze to drift through the room. A cheerful waitress greeted her by name before placing 2 steaming cups of lavender honey tea and a small plate of homemade butter cookies between them. "These are the best in the village," Evelyn said with quiet confidence. Lucien took one careful sip before smiling. "I believe you may be right." Their conversation wandered naturally from one simple subject to another. Evelyn spoke about growing lavender because her grandmother had once believed every flower carried a little piece of hope. Lucien listened far more than he spoke, asking thoughtful questions and smiling whenever Evelyn's eyes brightened with enthusiasm. When she asked whether traveling had become lonely, Lucien looked out toward the distant fields before answering honestly. "Sometimes it does. But every journey becomes worthwhile when you unexpectedly meet someone kind." Evelyn lowered her eyes toward her teacup, hiding another shy smile. Outside the cafe window, Children chased colorful butterflies between the lavender rows, while an elderly musician played a gentle tune nearby. Time seemed to slow without either of them noticing. Ash watched from a nearby bench while pretending to read an upside-down newspaper. "This," he murmured proudly, "is considerably less stressful than stealing cardigans." As the afternoon sun dipped lower across the valley, Evelyn looked back at Lucien with quiet curiosity. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "for someone I only met today, you seem strangely familiar." Lucien blinked once, caught completely off guard by Evelyn's gentle observation. For the first time in many years, the man who could calmly address an entire royal court needed an extra heartbeat to find the right words. A quiet smile finally appeared. "Perhaps we crossed paths without realizing it," he answered softly. Evelyn considered the possibility before laughing. "That would explain it. Our village welcomes many travelers every year." Somehow the simple explanation felt believable enough, and neither of them questioned it any further. They finished their tea without ever rushing the conversation. Instead, they spoke about favorite walking trails, the changing seasons, and how the lavender fields looked entirely different beneath sunrise than they did at sunset. Lucien discovered that Evelyn noticed the smallest details most people overlooked, from the first butterfly arriving each spring to the way evening light turned the flowers a softer shade of purple before dusk. Listening to her speak felt unexpectedly peaceful. Eventually, the empty teacups were cleared away, and Evelyn stood with an apologetic smile. "I should return home before it gets too late. There is always more work waiting in the garden." Lucien rose as well. "May I walk with you?" "I would like that," she answered without hesitation. They followed the narrow path leading away from the marketplace, passing rows of lavender that swayed gently beneath the warm afternoon breeze. The village grew quieter with every step until only birdsong and distant laughter remained. Along the roadside, Evelyn noticed a wooden planter that had tipped onto its side after one of its legs loosened. Several young lavender plants leaned awkwardly toward the ground. She immediately knelt beside it. "Oh dear, Mr. Dawson will be disappointed when he sees this." Without waiting to be asked, Lucien crouched beside her and steadied the planter while she adjusted the loose support beneath it. Their hands briefly reached for the same wooden peg at exactly the same moment. Both paused, exchanged an amused glance, and quietly laughed together before continuing. The simple moment lasted only a second, yet neither of them hurried to pull away. Once the planter stood firmly again, Evelyn brushed a little soil from her hands and smiled with quiet satisfaction. "There. Much better." Lucien looked at the thriving lavender plants instead of answering immediately. "You seem to make everything around you a little brighter." Evelyn lowered her eyes with a shy smile. "That may be the nicest thing anyone has said to me all week." Hidden several yards away behind a small delivery wagon, Ash watched the entire scene while pretending to organize empty wooden crates. He slowly shook his head with theatrical disbelief. "I spent weeks sneaking through gardens and negotiating with clotheslines," he whispered. Apparently, all His Majesty really needed was one honest conversation. A nearby stable horse looked curiously in his direction. Ash sighed. "Do not judge me. You were not there." The horse calmly returned to chewing hay, leaving Ash to nod as though he had somehow won the argument. As the path reached the edge of Evelyn's cottage, she stopped beside the white wooden gate, where fragrant lavender surrounded the garden in gentle waves of purple. The afternoon sun painted everything with a warm golden glow. Lucien knew he should leave before the moment became difficult, yet every part of him wished the walk had lasted just a little longer. Evelyn rested one hand on the gate and looked at him with the same welcoming smile she had offered every neighbor in the village, though somehow it now felt a little more personal. "I enjoyed today," she said honestly. Lucien smiled back. "So did I." She hesitated for only a heartbeat before asking the question that neither of them had expected to matter quite so much. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Lucien met her eyes, feeling an unfamiliar warmth settle quietly inside his heart. "If you would like me to," he answered. Evelyn's smile widened just enough to make the fading sunlight seem brighter. "Then I will make another pot of lavender honey tea." The next morning arrived wrapped in soft golden sunlight, and before the first customers wandered into the village square, Evelyn had already placed 2 teacups on the small wooden table beside her kitchen window. She paused for a moment after setting down the second cup and smiled quietly to herself. Just in case, she whispered, pretending she had prepared it only because she enjoyed symmetry. Yet every few minutes her eyes drifted toward the white garden gate, without her even noticing. Across the valley, Lucien kept his promise. Dressed once again in the simple clothes of an ordinary traveler, he walked the familiar road toward the village with a lighter heart than he had carried in years. Ash followed several yards behind, carrying an empty basket beneath one foreleg. "I am only here in case someone suddenly needs emergency gardening assistance," he announced proudly. Lucien glanced over his shoulder with an amused smile. "Naturally. I have many talents," Ash replied. "Remaining uninvolved is not one of them." When Lucien reached the cottage, Evelyn was already kneeling among the lavender rows, gently gathering fresh blossoms into small bundles. She looked up at the sound of approaching footsteps, and the smile that brightened her face appeared so naturally that Lucien realized she had truly hoped he would return. "Good morning," she greeted warmly. "I was beginning to think the tea might become lonely." Lucien laughed softly. "I could not let that happen." After sharing another quiet cup of lavender honey tea beneath the shade of the porch, Evelyn invited him into the garden where dozens of fragrant plants swayed gently beneath the summer breeze. "Would you mind helping me harvest a few rows?" she asked. "Only if you promise not to judge my gardening skills," Lucien answered. "That depends," Evelyn teased. "Can you tell the difference between lavender and weeds?" "I am optimistic." She laughed again, handed him a small basket, and together they moved carefully through the flowering rows. They worked without rushing, occasionally exchanging stories, sometimes speaking, sometimes simply enjoying the peaceful silence that settled comfortably between them. Lucien noticed how gently Evelyn handled every stem, trimming each flower with patient care instead of hurrying through the task. "You treat them as though they are listening," he observed. Evelyn smiled without looking up. "Perhaps they are. I think beautiful things grow better when they know someone appreciates them." The words lingered quietly in Lucien's thoughts long after she had spoken them. Hidden behind an old stone well near the edge of the property, Ash peeked over the rim just enough to watch the two of them working together. "Yesterday they shared tea," he whispered to himself. "Today they are harvesting lavender. At this pace, they will be baking bread together before the month is over." A curious duck wandered past the well and stared directly at him. Ash slowly lowered himself out of sight. "You saw nothing," he whispered. A gentle breeze drifted across the garden, lifting a freshly washed lavender scarf hanging from a nearby clothesline. Lucien noticed it immediately. Not long ago, seeing that familiar scarf would have awakened the restless longing that had once kept him awake night after night. Now he simply smiled, grateful that it remained exactly where it belonged. As they continued gathering flowers side by side, Evelyn glanced toward him with quiet curiosity. "Lucien," she asked gently, "what made you stop traveling?" Lucien remained quiet for a moment after Evelyn's gentle question, carefully placing another bundle of freshly cut lavender into the basket before answering. "I suppose I realized that no matter how many roads I followed, I was always searching for something I could not name." His voice carried a quiet honesty that surprised even himself. Evelyn looked at him thoughtfully. "And did you ever find it?" A warm breeze drifted between the lavender rows as Lucien met her eyes. "I think I may be closer than I expected." Evelyn smiled softly, accepting the answer without pressing him for more. Somehow it felt as though every conversation with Lucien carried a few unspoken thoughts, yet none of them felt uncomfortable. They simply waited patiently, like flowers blooming in their own season. Together they lifted the nearly full basket of lavender, each taking one handle. Their hands brushed briefly as they adjusted their grip, and both laughed at the same time before continuing toward the drying shed. "We seem to have excellent timing," Evelyn joked. "Or equally poor timing," Lucien answered with an amused smile. "Either way, it appears to work." They carefully spread the lavender across long wooden shelves where sunlight filtered gently through open windows. The sweet fragrance filled the little building, wrapping the quiet afternoon in calm familiarity. Evelyn looked around with quiet satisfaction. "This is my favorite place on the property," she admitted. "Whenever life becomes busy, I come here for a few minutes. Everything feels simpler." Lucien slowly nodded. "I understand that feeling better than you know." Hidden behind a stack of empty wooden barrels near the back fence, Ash attempted to remain unnoticed while casually pretending to inspect a wheelbarrow that clearly did not need inspecting. Unfortunately, 3 curious ducks waddled toward him in a perfectly organized line. The first duck tilted its head. The second gave a suspicious little quack. The third confidently pecked at one of Ash's paws. Ash looked down with exaggerated disappointment. "Gentlemen," he whispered, "I respect your commitment to security, but I assure you I am already employed." The ducks responded with 3 louder quacks before marching after him as he quietly retreated around the corner. "I cannot believe I am being outsmarted by waterfowl," he sighed. Back in the garden, Evelyn carried 2 empty watering cans toward the well. Lucien reached for one automatically. "Allow me." She looked at him with an appreciative smile. "You always seem ready to help." Lucien hesitated for the smallest moment before answering. "Helping someone kind never feels like work." The words escaped before he had time to soften them, leaving both of them standing in comfortable silence. Evelyn lowered her eyes with a shy smile, and together they carried the filled watering cans back toward the lavender rows beneath the golden afternoon light. When the work was finally finished, Lucien reluctantly knew it was time to leave. As he stepped onto the village road, the distant sound of approaching carriage wheels echoed across the valley. A royal carriage rounded the bend, its polished crest catching the sunlight. The driver looked ahead, then suddenly straightened in surprise as recognition flashed across his face. At the very same instant, Ash emerged from behind the fence, his ears lifting in alarm. Lucien's calm expression changed for the first time that day as he quietly realized the peaceful life he had carefully hidden might be only seconds away from being discovered. The polished royal carriage rolled steadily along the village road, its silver wolf crest catching the afternoon sunlight as it approached the lavender fields. Lucien recognized it immediately. So did Ash. Before the driver could call out in surprise, Lucien raised one hand almost casually, his expression calm but unmistakably firm. The coachman blinked once, understood the silent command at once, and respectfully lowered his eyes without speaking a single word. The carriage continued forward as though nothing unusual had happened. Evelyn watched the elegant carriage pass with quiet curiosity before looking back at Lucien. She noticed the brief exchange, but could not quite understand it. "Do you know the people traveling inside?" she asked. Lucien offered a gentle smile that carried both honesty and careful restraint. "Only a little." It was not a lie, yet the answer still left an uncomfortable weight in his heart. Across the road, Ash casually stepped into view carrying the empty gardening basket beneath one foreleg. "Beautiful afternoon for traveling," he cheerfully called toward the coachman while pretending to admire one of the carriage wheels. The driver caught the hint immediately. "Indeed it is," he answered with perfect composure before lightly guiding the horses onward without another glance toward Lucien. Ash waited until the carriage disappeared around the next bend before quietly releasing the breath he had been holding. "That was closer than I would have preferred," he muttered. A nearby farmer smiled politely at him. "Talking to yourself again?" Ash straightened proudly. "Professional habit." The farmer simply laughed and continued down the road. Back in the lavender garden, Evelyn tilted her head thoughtfully. "For a moment, you looked worried." Lucien looked toward the distant hills where the carriage had vanished. "Sometimes old responsibilities have a way of finding us, even when we are hoping for a peaceful afternoon." Evelyn studied his expression with quiet understanding. She did not ask another question. Instead, she reached down and gently brushed a tiny lavender petal from the sleeve of his jacket. "Then I hope today gave you at least a little peace before those responsibilities return." Her small act of kindness caught Lucien completely by surprise. "It did," he answered softly. "Much more than a little." They continued walking through the garden together, yet Lucien's thoughts no longer felt as light as they had only minutes before. Every laugh they shared now carried a quiet reminder that this simple happiness rested upon a truth he had not yet found the courage to reveal. He had never wanted to deceive Evelyn. Each passing day simply made the right moment more difficult to find. As the afternoon slowly faded toward evening, Lucien reluctantly prepared to leave once again. He paused beside the white garden gate and looked back at Evelyn standing among the lavender blossoms, smiling as she waved goodbye. He returned the smile, but this time it carried a quiet promise meant only for himself. On the long walk back toward Blackwood Palace, the distant towers slowly rose above the trees. Lucien stopped for a brief moment, looking from the castle ahead to the peaceful village behind him. I cannot hide forever, he whispered into the gentle evening breeze before continuing home with a heart that had never felt so full or so uncertain. 2 peaceful days passed before Lucien returned to the village once again. This time the smile Evelyn offered him appeared even before he reached the white garden gate, as though she had quietly begun recognizing the sound of his footsteps along the familiar path. "You came back," she said warmly. Lucien smiled. "I told you I would." She poured 2 cups of fresh lavender honey tea before either of them spoke another word, and somehow the comfortable silence between them felt just as welcoming as their conversations. They spent the afternoon strolling slowly through the lavender fields, stopping now and then to admire butterflies drifting lazily between the blossoms or listening to the distant songs of meadow birds. Neither of them felt the need to hurry. Every ordinary moment somehow became memorable simply because they were sharing it together. After a while, Evelyn glanced toward Lucien with quiet curiosity. "You have seemed thoughtful ever since the carriage passed the other day." Lucien lowered his eyes for a brief moment before answering honestly. "There is something about my life that I have not told you yet." Evelyn waited patiently without interrupting. "Not because I wish to deceive you," he continued softly, "only because I have been searching for the right time." She looked at him with the same gentle understanding that had first captured his heart during the festival. "Everyone carries a story that takes courage to tell," she replied. "Whenever you are ready, I will listen." Those simple words eased a burden Lucien had quietly carried for days. He smiled with sincere gratitude. "Thank you." Nearby, Ash stood beside a vegetable stand enthusiastically comparing 2 pumpkins while secretly keeping watch over the conversation from a respectful distance. "Definitely this one," he whispered to himself while lifting the larger pumpkin. The elderly farmer behind the stand folded his arms. "Planning to make soup?" Ash blinked once before placing the pumpkin back down. "No, sir. I am conducting advanced agricultural research." The farmer laughed so hard he nearly dropped his hat. Ash accepted the unexpected victory with a proud little nod before quietly wandering away again. As the afternoon sunlight softened into warm shades of gold, Lucien and Evelyn slowly returned toward the cottage. A gentle breeze stirred the lavender around them, carrying the familiar fragrance that had once been the beginning of everything. Near the gate, Lucien reached into the pocket of his simple traveling jacket to retrieve a handkerchief after helping secure a loose ribbon around one of Evelyn's flower baskets. Neither of them noticed that a small silver clasp fastened inside the pocket slipped free and disappeared silently into the grass. They exchanged one final smile before Lucien reluctantly began the walk back toward the road. Evelyn remained at the gate until he disappeared beyond the gentle curve of the lavender fields. Only then did she glance down while gathering her basket and notice something catching the late afternoon sunlight among the grass. Curious, she bent down and picked up the tiny silver clasp. Delicately engraved upon its polished surface was the elegant crest of a silver wolf surrounded by a royal laurel, crafted with remarkable precision unlike anything she had ever seen carried by an ordinary traveler. She turned it gently between her fingers, her thoughtful smile slowly fading into quiet curiosity. "Lucien," she whispered softly to herself, "who are you really?" Evelyn turned the small silver clasp over in her hands several times that evening as warm candlelight reflected across its carefully engraved surface. The elegant silver wolf surrounded by a delicate royal laurel was unlike anything she had ever seen worn by an ordinary traveler. Even so, she did not feel frightened or betrayed. More than anything, she simply felt curious. She carefully wrapped the clasp inside a soft linen cloth and placed it beside the vase of freshly cut lavender on her bedside table. "I am sure there is a simple explanation," she whispered before blowing out the candle. The following morning, after finishing her usual work in the garden, Evelyn carried the clasp into the village and stopped at the small workshop of Mr. Whitmore, the elderly silversmith whose family had crafted jewelry and ceremonial pieces for generations. The old craftsman adjusted his spectacles, accepted the clasp with surprising care, and studied every engraved detail beneath the morning sunlight streaming through the window. His thoughtful expression gradually shifted into quiet recognition. "This is extraordinary workmanship," he murmured. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. Have you seen one before? Mr. Whitmore nodded slowly. Only once, many years ago. Pieces like this are never sold in village markets. He gently traced the silver wolf with one finger before returning the clasp to Evelyn's open palm. Whoever owns this serves someone of great importance. Members of the royal household sometimes carry items bearing this crest. They are symbols of trust rather than wealth. Evelyn looked down thoughtfully at the little silver emblem resting in her hand. So the owner works for the palace? The old silversmith smiled kindly. Perhaps, or very close to someone who does. I cannot say more than that. Evelyn thanked him warmly before stepping back into the bright afternoon sunshine. As she slowly walked through the village square, children laughed while chasing one another between flower stalls, yet her thoughts remained quietly fixed upon the silver clasp. She remembered every conversation she had shared with Lucien, every quiet smile, every thoughtful gesture, and every kind word. None of them felt dishonest. Yet now she understood there was a part of his life he had carefully protected from her. Why did you never tell me? She wondered softly, not with anger, but with gentle confusion. At Blackwood Palace, Lucien stood alone inside his private study overlooking the distant Lavender Valley. Ash quietly entered carrying a neatly polished wooden box before placing it upon the desk, without speaking. Lucien slowly opened the lid. Folded carefully inside rested the lavender scarf that had first carried Evelyn's gentle fragrance into his restless nights. For several silent moments, he simply looked at it. Then, with a peaceful smile that carried gratitude instead of longing, he lifted the scarf one final time before folding it even more carefully than before. He closed the lid, slid the wooden box toward Ash, and quietly exhaled. It is time to return everything, he said. Ash looked from the box to his oldest friend and slowly smiled. I was hoping you would say that. The following afternoon, Lucien walked toward the little white cottage carrying the polished wooden box beneath one arm. Every step along the familiar village road felt heavier than the last, not because he feared losing Evelyn's trust, but because he feared realizing how much her opinion had already come to mean to him. When he reached the garden gate, Evelyn was waiting beside the lavender rose with the small silver clasp resting carefully in her hand. She smiled gently, though her eyes carried quiet curiosity instead of their usual carefree ease. I believe this belongs to you, she said, holding it toward him. Lucien looked at the clasp, then slowly closed his fingers around it. For several long moments he said nothing. Finally, he looked into Evelyn's eyes with calm sincerity. Before we became friends, I should have introduced myself honestly. Evelyn remained silent, giving him all the time he needed. Lucien placed the wooden box upon the nearby garden table and opened the lid. Inside rested the carefully folded lavender scarf that had quietly begun everything. This belongs to you as well, he said softly. Evelyn stared at the familiar scarf in surprise before looking back at Lucien. You found it. Lucien lowered his eyes for a brief moment. Not exactly. A small, embarrassed smile appeared despite the seriousness of the moment. The truth is, it was taken because of me. Evelyn blinked once in genuine confusion. Lucien took a slow breath before continuing. The day we first met at the festival, your lavender fragrance stayed in my memory long after I returned home. I could not explain it, and I made a foolish decision. I asked my oldest friend to secretly borrow your scarf. He gently touched the edge of the wooden box. Later, he borrowed other clothing as well. Nothing was ever damaged. Everything was carefully protected. Even so, it was wrong, and I am deeply sorry. Evelyn listened quietly, her surprise slowly giving way to thoughtful understanding rather than anger. Lucien continued before hesitation could silence him again. There is one more truth I owe you. He carefully fastened the silver clasp back onto his traveling cloak before meeting her eyes once more. My full name is Lucien Ashford. A gentle breeze stirred the lavender blossoms around them as he spoke the words he had hidden for so long. I am the Alpha King of Blackwood. The garden fell peacefully quiet. Birds continued singing somewhere beyond the fields while sunlight drifted softly across the flowers. Evelyn looked at him for several silent moments, not because she doubted him, but because she was gently fitting together every unanswered question she had quietly carried in her heart. Finally, she smiled with quiet disbelief. So, you never came here because you were a king. Lucien slowly shook his head. No. His voice carried the simplest truth he had ever spoken. I came back because I could not forget you. Several yards away, Ash watched from behind an old apple tree with both paws folded tightly together. Please let this go well, he whispered nervously. I truly do not have another laundry mission left in me. Evelyn looked from Lucien to the wooden box resting between them, then back into his hopeful eyes. A slow, gentle smile returned to her face, warmer than the afternoon sunlight surrounding the lavender field. Yet before she answered, she quietly reached toward the box and rested one hand upon the folded scarf. For a long, quiet moment, neither of them spoke. Evelyn's hand rested gently upon the folded lavender scarf inside the wooden box, while the afternoon breeze carried the familiar fragrance through the garden once more. She slowly lifted her eyes to meet Lucien's, and instead of disappointment, he saw kindness waiting there. Do you know what surprised me the most? She asked softly. Lucien shook his head. It was never that you are the Alpha King, she replied. It was realizing how long you carried all of this by yourself. Lucien looked down with a faint, regretful smile. I thought every day that passed would make telling the truth easier. Instead, every day made your friendship more precious, and I became afraid of losing it. Evelyn listened quietly before stepping a little closer to him. You should have trusted me sooner. You are right, Lucien answered without hesitation. I should have. He took a slow breath, his voice calm and sincere. I cannot change the foolish choices I made. I can only promise that if you allow me another chance, there will never be another secret between us. Evelyn studied his face for a few thoughtful seconds before her gentle smile slowly returned. Well, she said, tilting her head ever so slightly, you certainly chose a very unusual way to introduce yourself. Lucien blinked once before a quiet laugh escaped him, followed almost immediately by Evelyn's own laughter. The sound carried across the lavender field, washing away the last trace of uncertainty that had lingered between them. Hidden behind the old apple tree, Ash cautiously peeked around the trunk after hearing the laughter. That sounds encouraging, he whispered hopefully. Evelyn glanced toward the tree with a playful smile. You may as well come out now. Ash froze completely. After a long moment, he slowly stepped into view, wearing the expression of someone who had accepted his fate long before arriving. Good afternoon, he offered politely. Evelyn folded her arms, though amusement sparkled in her eyes. So you are the famous friend. Ash cleared his throat. I prefer the term loyal assistant. Lucien gently rubbed his forehead. Ash. Very loyal assistant, Ash corrected with a sheepish grin. Evelyn looked at him for a moment before asking the question that had clearly waited several weeks to be spoken. How many times did you sneak into my garden? Ash looked thoughtfully toward the sky as though calculating an especially difficult equation. Would you prefer the official number or the number that makes me sound slightly more respectable? Lucien closed his eyes with quiet embarrassment, while Evelyn laughed so warmly that even the nearby birds seemed to pause and listen. Ash finally sighed with theatrical surrender. More than I should have. Evelyn shook her head, unable to hide her smile. Next time, you can simply knock on the front door. Ash placed one paw over his heart with dramatic relief. That is the happiest sentence I have heard all year. Even Lucien could not stop smiling. As the laughter slowly settled into another comfortable silence, he looked back at Evelyn with quiet hope. May I visit again tomorrow? Evelyn glanced toward the open front gate before looking at him once more, her eyes shining with gentle affection. You finally know where the front gate is, she teased. I think that is a much better place to begin. Several joyful weeks slipped by as quietly as drifting lavender petals. There were no more secret visits beneath moonlight, no more mysterious footprints beside the clothesline, and certainly no more midnight missions involving scarves or sweaters. Every morning, Lucien entered the village through the front gate with an easy smile, greeted every neighbor by name, and spent his afternoons exactly where he wanted to be, beside Evelyn. The villagers eventually discovered that the kind traveler they had welcomed so warmly was, in fact, the Alpha King of Blackwood. To everyone's surprise, very little changed. Children still waved excitedly whenever Lucien walked past. The baker still insisted he take home fresh bread. Mr. Whitmore still reminded him to polish the silver clasp properly. Life simply continued, only with a few more respectful bows and many more cheerful smiles. Evelyn often laughed whenever someone addressed Lucien with grand royal titles, because only moments later she would find him kneeling in the garden with dirt on his sleeves, happily helping her replant lavender after a summer rain. One bright afternoon, several children came running toward Ash with enormous excitement. "The laundry wolf is here," one little boy shouted before the others eagerly joined in. "Laundry wolf! Laundry wolf!" Ash stopped walking so abruptly that Lucien nearly laughed aloud. "I carried out one confidential royal assignment," Ash protested with dramatic dignity. "One. A single mission. History has been terribly unfair to me." The children only laughed harder before handing him a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "We made you lavender cookies," a little girl said proudly. Ash accepted the gift with complete seriousness before quietly smiling. "I suppose retirement does have its rewards." From that day forward, the nickname never disappeared, though Ash eventually pretended not to mind whenever it echoed across the village square. As autumn painted the hills with warm shades of gold, Lucien found himself spending as much time in Evelyn's cottage as he did inside Blackwood Palace. One peaceful evening, the fire crackled gently inside the stone fireplace, while soft sunset light filtered through the window beside the simple wooden bed. The familiar fragrance of lavender filled the cozy little home exactly as it always had, except now there were no secrets left hiding among its gentle perfume. Evelyn finished folding a freshly washed lavender scarf before looking over her shoulder with playful amusement sparkling in her eyes. "So, my king," she teased, "should I start hiding my scarves again?" Lucien looked at her with exaggerated surprise before a delighted laugh escaped him. "Absolutely not," he replied as he stepped closer. In one joyful motion, he gently lifted her into his arms and spun her in a slow circle, careful and light-hearted, until both of them were laughing so hard that neither could finish another sentence. When he finally set her back on her feet, he rested his forehead lightly against hers for just a brief moment, smiling with peaceful contentment. "My little Lavender," he said warmly, "I do not need borrowed scarves anymore. The sweetest part of your lavender has always been the happiness I find beside you." Evelyn's smile softened as she reached up and straightened the collar of his jacket. "That is a much better answer than stealing sweaters." They laughed together once again. Outside the open window, Ash happened to be passing with a basket of apples when he accidentally overheard the conversation. He stopped, looked toward the evening sky, and slowly shook his head with a satisfied grin. "Well," he announced proudly to absolutely no one in particular, "the Royal Laundry Department is officially retired." Lucien heard him through the window and called back with a laugh. "Keep it that way." "Gladly," Ash answered. "I have developed a strong preference for using front doors." A gentle breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of lavender across the room as a familiar scarf fluttered quietly on the clothesline outside. Lucien looked toward it for a moment, smiled, and made no attempt to reach for it. Instead, Evelyn stepped outside, took the scarf down herself, returned with a gentle smile, and lovingly draped it across his shoulders. He looked at her with grateful eyes, realizing that the gift he had once foolishly tried to borrow had become something she now freely shared. Hand in hand, they stepped through the front door together into the golden evening, while behind them Ash happily munched a lavender cookie and quietly reminded himself that some royal missions truly did deserve a happy ending.